Welcome back, everyone, and today we're going to continue on with the Blender 3D Noob to Pro wiki book and in 2.8. And the last time we went into we were trying to look through the world here, and um, we were messing with the background and stuff. In fact, in the enter the world thing here, right? It has all of this stuff, and of course 2.8 doesn't have that stuff because this had specifically to do with the renderer, and they're not even using their same renderer anymore. So I am not really that worried about it. But we are going to continue. We're going to go to the understanding the camera here, and let's go ahead and hit start here. I'll end it at about 10 minutes. Um, so if you notice here, I did this little bit of a different kind of layout because if you do this, you notice that this some of the stuff gets cut off, and that's probably partly because it's beta, I suppose. That is assuming somebody catches it. So I'm doing it horizontally instead of vertically, um, and having it overlap a little bit so you can actually see both windows at the same time, even though I switch and I still have a little bit of extra area in there. So this is what I am going to do. We're going to go this, and we're going to try to do this improving your house, and then we'll see if then maybe I'll switch back to because it'll be the end of section whatever 2A or whatever it was. So I'll be able to switch back to John Lemon, and then I'll do a little bit more of it, and then I'll switch back here, and so on and so forth until we get them done. And actually, I found a simpler Unity tutorial. So we're going to finish John Lemon, and then when I finish John Lemon, I'm going to go through the simple tutorial, because that's really what I was concerned with my demo, because my little demo is just basically going to be like an object moving around the floor and being able to go to different places to be able to interact with objects and stuff in Unity. And so that shouldn't be too difficult to come up with. But I should have done the simpler one first. If I would have found it, I would have used it. But in any case, let's continue on here. Real world cameras. Before discussing the camera in Blender, it helps to understand something about how cameras work in real life. We have become accustomed to so many of their quirks and limitations when looking at real photographs that 3D software like Blender often expends a lot of effort to mimic these quirks. When taking a photo with a real camera, a number of important factors come into play. The focus. Because of the way lenses work, only objects within a certain distance range from the camera, the depth of field, will appear sharp in the image. Objects outside this range will begin to appear noticeably blurred. The blur getting worse the farther they are outside the focus range. The narrower the range of in-focus distances, the shallower depth of field, the more quickly this blurring happens with objects outside it. The exposure time, how long a shutter remains open. The longer this is, the more light is captured, but more likely the image is to pick up motion. Pardon me? Sneezing, I just don't like sneezing, so I try to stop myself from sneezing. And I seem to sneeze here and at my computer desk quite a bit. Okay, the exposure time, how long a shutter remains open, the longer this is, the more light is captured, also more likely the image is to pick up motion blur from moving objects. And I don't really know how digital cameras handle it, but digitally, with actual film, there's literally more light getting exposed to the film the longer the shutter remains open. But in digital, they have to somehow duplicate it in digital. I don't know how that works, but I suppose if you get a good high-end digital like SLR or something, it's just like a regular film camera, I suppose. It's also how to get some cool things like the light drawing, basically by keeping the shutter open longer. Then when you move the light, the like a flashlight, it retains the light on there, and so literally you're drawing light. And this is also how you get those cool rotating star fields where they take a picture of the night sky like time lapse, but keep the shutter open, and so the stars tend to streak the sky. In fact, that's even how they did um, that's how they did the hyperspace, the light speed, the when the starships in Star Wars go into light speed, go into hyperspace. Well, before they go into actual hyperspace, when you see the stars kind of streak like that, like that. um, Basically, what they did is they'd have this black material that they had poked holes through that they put tiny lights in, and then the camera is on it, and then they would move the camera forward. How they say they did it? They move the camera forward, and then they move the lights forward, and then they keep the shutter exposed, uh, shutter exposure open longer, so that when it does it, the longer the lines get, and it makes that cool light speed effect, which now you can just kind of do with the computer all the time. But anyways, the aperture, how wide the iris opening is, this is expressed not as an actual distance measurement, but as a fraction of the focal length of the lens, loosely distance between the lens and the image capturing surface when the image is properly focused, written as f. Thus, say f 2.8, f over 2.8, not f 2.8. Okay, so f slash or f over 2.8 is a larger number, hence representing a wider aperture than f over 8 or f slash 8. A wider aperture increases the amount of light being captured without contributing to motion blur, but it reduces the depth of field. The extreme case of a pinhole camera has a very tiny aperture with infinite depth of field, no need to focus at all, but captures very little light, so it needs a very well lit scene, a long exposure, and a very sensitive image capturing surface. The sensitivity of the image capturing surface to light. In the days of film cameras, we talked about film sensitivity, fast film being more sensitive to light than slow film. Nowadays, with digital cameras, we talk about the gain of the light amplification system. High sensitivity film was more likely to produce a grainy image. In somewhat similar manner, high light amplification in digital cameras is more likely to produce a noisy looking image under low light conditions. The field of view, how much of the scene of the camera can see at once. A wide-angle lens gives a wider field of view, but you have to be closer to the objects to be able to see them. There's a greater perspective distortion. At another extreme, a telephoto lens gives a very narrow field of view, but can take pictures of things from much further away. A wide-angle lens also has a shorter focal length than the narrow-angle one. Remember, the aperture expressed as a ratio of the focal length f. Therefore, the telephoto lens is going to capture less light than the wide-angle one with the same aperture width. You may have heard of the zoom lens, i.e. one with a variable focal length. It can be adjusted from wide-angle mode to telephoto mode. As you can see, many of these different factors interact with each other. The brightness of the image can be affected by exposure time, the aperture and gain sensitivity of the focal length of the lens. Each of these have negative side effects on the image in other ways. Blender and other computer graphic software are in principle free of problems of focus, exposure time, aperture, sensitivity, and focal length. Nevertheless, it is common to want to introduce deliberate motion blur into an image to give the impression of movement. Sometimes it's useful to introduce a deliberately shallow depth of field, blurring objects in the background in order to draw emphasis to an important part of the image, i.e. that which is in focus. Exposure, total amount of light captured in the image, is also less of a problem than in computer graphics. Less of a problem in computer graphics than real world photography, because in computer graphics you always have total control over the amount and placement of lighting in the scene. Nevertheless, if you're not careful, you can produce overexposed bright parts that lose in detail by saturating to a solid featureless white, or underexposing images, dark parts lose in detail by becoming solid black. The field of view issue arises from basic principles of geometry, and Blender's camera is just as much subject to that as real cameras. The camera in Blender. Here we are going to concentrate on the important issue of field of view. You can change the field of view in two ways. Move the camera closer to or further from the scene, called dollying in film and TV production parlance, or change the angle of the lens, zooming. You do the latter in the Object Data tab in the Properties window. The camera has to be selected by the right mouse button in object mode, or the required tab will not be visible. So I don't know if, let's see, move the camera closer and further from the scene, or change the angle of lens. So we don't have a separate like camera deal. Where's the camera? This is the camera here. Just like that. And if I go to Object, let's see, Instancing, Motion Pass, Viewport Display, Custom Properties. Oh, just like the light, I guess, when you select the light, you have the little light bulb. Apparently the camera does have specific camera deals. Focal length, lens unit, shift, clip start. We have depth of field, which is kind of cool that you can kind of do that. Aperture. It looks like it has everything in here, all the settings you'd want. Okay, so perspective is the... Oh, so this is actually the same way. The tab isn't visible unless you select it. Just the same way with the actual with the lights. Perspective is a phenomenon where objects that are further away from the viewer look smaller than those nearby. More than that, different parts of the same object may be different distance from the eye, leading to a change in apparent shape of the object called perspective distortion. The mathematical theory of perspective was worked out by Alhazen in the 11th century, famously adopted by Italian Renaissance painters 400 years later. There are two renders of the same scene with two different cameras to illustrate the difference. This one moves the camera closer because of a wider field of view, which is here. I can do this to actually give us so we can see the whole thing. Okay, and then this one moves the camera back by while narrowing its field of view to try to give the same scene the overall same size. And that, yeah, you less of perspective. This seems to be a little bit more distorted, possibly. The latter is like using a telephoto lens with a real camera. Notice how the wider field of view gives us greater perspective effect. The boxes are all cuboids with the parallel bars of the opposite faces joined by parallel edges. Yet there's a noticeable angle between the notionally parallel edges in both images, which is more pronounced in the upper image. That is what perspective distortion is about. Right, so it looks a little bit more distorted. This looks a little bit more, if you want to compare it to like isometric game, right? 2-point perspective, but we're all the in an isometric graphics, all the angles are the same, relatively 30 degrees or something like that, and the same like length and distance. It just sort of looks more like that in the bottom one. See, these are like parallel lines, and here is they're kind of not quite as parallel, I'm noticing. Okay, so that should be all for this video, and stay tuned and you'll see the next video in a few hours, I guess. So I'll see you then. And we're